Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special 5x15 event with Jonathan Watts, Global Environment Editor at The Guardian, and Gaia Vince, the award-winning author of Transcendence and Nomad Century. They will be in conversation this evening discussing the life and legacy of British journalist Dom Phillips and his important and ultimately hopeful book, How to Save the Amazon, a testament to his pioneering work uncovering the truth about deforestation and searching for solutions. You can order copies of How to Save the Amazon from Newham Bookshop tonight, our independent bookselling partner, and information about how to do that will be posted in the chat shortly. Jonathan and Guy will speak for around an hour this evening, and there will be time towards the end of the discussion for your questions, so please do submit these in the Zoom Q&A box at any time during the event, and we'll get to as many as we can. It's my pleasure to welcome Jonathan and Gaia tonight. Over to you.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's so good for me to talk to John tonight, wherever you are. Maybe it's the morning, and we are talking about something extraordinary. So we're talking about the Amazon. The Amazon is a place of superlatives. It covers an area larger than Europe. It contains more than 10% of the world's known biodiversity, 15% of the world's fresh water. It's absolutely enormous in terms of the territory it covers. It covers 9 different nations. 34 million people live in the Amazon. And among those people are 350 different indigenous ethnic groups in over 3,000 territories who live in around 25% of the Amazon. So it's very important for the people of that area, of course, but it's also of huge planetary significance, partly because of the way it cycles freshwater, and partly because of its importance in climate change, in the carbon cycle. So it's one of the world's largest carbon sinks. So it is very important, and of course, as we all know, it's under threat, and that brings us to this extraordinary book. And I'm gonna, I don't know if this is going to reverse my screen, but as I hold it up, this is the book that Dom Phillips started, and that was ultimately finished by his colleagues, his friends, and other experts, including John Watts. And this book that was originally the work of Dom Phillips, it brings us to really talk about him to start with. He started off being a music journalist. John, you knew him really well. Tell me a little bit about him. How on earth did he end up in the Amazon? What was he like as a person? Can you hear me, John?
Thanks, Guy. Can you hear me? I can hear
Yeah,
you.
you
I have a
just
very
cut out. I
unstable
don't know
network here.
if there's a little bit of a delay, but we'll pause a bit to allow you to catch up on the time delay. But if there is more of a problem, I will tell you a little bit more about the book myself. But let's try again. I was really interested to hear a little bit about the guy that started this, Dom Phillips, a British music journalist who you knew. I mean, he used to work for The Guardian, which is, you run the environment site there. Tell me a little bit about Dom.
Thanks, Gaia. I'm going to switch to just audio because I think that might help with the bandwidth problems, and you're really not missing much by looking at my face.
Oh.
But first, before I say that, can I just thank you and everyone involved in 5x15 for this event. This is kind of historic for all of us who were involved in producing this book, because it's been 3 years in the making, and this is the first public event where we've been able to talk about the book. So it's really emotional.
This is hugely exciting. It's hugely exciting for me, because you sent me an early copy of it, and as soon as I saw it, I knew it was something really, really special. What you've done together is something extraordinary, and I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the process of bringing out this book. But tell me first a little bit about Dom, because he's not here tonight to talk to us about his own idea.
Yeah, and oh, if only he were. Dom was, well, first of all, a really good mate. I think that's the simplest way I can describe him. You know, with his death, since his death, he's become to some a hero, to others a martyr for the Amazon, and to some degree he is both of those things. Certainly very courageous, but the Dom I knew was a bloke from the Wirral who was my first friend when I moved to Rio de Janeiro in 2012. He had he was a very stylish guy. He had been a music journalist. He'd been editor of Mixmag at the height of, you know, the rave era, and was very cool. He used to be known as Mr. Cool. And yet, when I met him, he'd already undergone kind of one transformation in moving to Brazil. I remember he was absolutely fascinated with the idea of the alegria, the happiness, the joy of Brazil and how authentic it was. And then in the following years, we would sometimes work together and often talk together. We would cycle together, and you know, I saw him become more and more interested in environmental issues, to the point where it became, you know, at the Amazon in particular, and the role of indigenous people in the Amazon became not just an occupation but a passion. You know, Don was a very diligent journalist. He was learning his trade as a foreign correspondent, having been a music journalist, but he learned very quickly. He was very generous with his advice for younger journalists, very meticulous, and courageous. Firstly, in committing himself so fully to this book. You know, he took a year off, and he wasn't a staff correspondent with a secure full-time job to fall back on. He was a freelancer who had to hustle quite a bit to make ends meet sometimes. And yet he felt so strongly about this subject that he gave up for a year and just threw himself into this book. And he really wanted it to be a big turning point in his life and in his career. And secondly, he was, you know, incredibly courageous because he went to places that aren't always easy and have some risks, as we learned with very tragically 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the book, what struck me about this was that unlike a lot of environmental books, he didn't, you know, Don wasn't interested in only telling the story of the people trying to conserve the Amazon. He was really, you know, he didn't just take the perspective of the victims. He also wanted to go to huge lengths to try and understand why those people who were ultimately damaging the environment in some way, what drove them, why they were doing it, what the reason was. He didn't, you know, he really tried to give other people, you know, people from all sides, you know, a different perspective. But, you know, as you say, it was incredibly dangerous work. Would you be able to read a passage from the book? There's one that really it really brings out the kinds of danger that a daily life really in parts of the Amazon today.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, Gaia. I'll read a chapter. I'll read a passage from the first chapter of the book, which is entirely written by Dom. It's one of the ones that he completed before his death. We drove into Anapu through an arch that read, "Welcome, you are our happiness." Underneath the word Anapu,
John, you're breaking up a little bit. Do you want to try that once more? And if not, I can read that passage while we try and fix your sound. It might be better for you to log out and in again, perhaps.
That passage for me, and I will try to log back in.
Yeah, can you remind me the page? I think I've got it.
Yep, it's page 56.
Yes, okay, I have it. So if you log it back in
will.
while I read this. So
I'll do that.
this is from How to Save the Amazon, from his book, and this is some of his writing that I'm reading now, some of Dom's writing. We drove into Anapu through an arch that read, "Welcome, you are our happiness." Underneath the word Anapu, the letters CV had been sprayed for the Commando Vermelho, or Red Command, one of Brazil's most powerful and vicious drug gangs. It was just one sign of how violent this dusty roadside town on the Trans-Amazon Highway in Pará State can be. Then we crossed a wooden bridge with rattling planks and found a shrine to Sister Dorothy Stang, an American nun and activist who fought to get land for poor Amazonian people to live on and protect, who was murdered in the forest an hour from here in 2005, in a killing that shone the world's spotlight on the Amazon's relentless brutality. Her group of Catholic nuns still lives and works here, and on their patch of land there is a small forest reserve named after her, a rudimentary chapel and nursery where they grow seedlings for the poor farmers she was helping when she lost her life. There was no security on their compound, just a wooden gate. A tall red wooden cross plunged into the ground beside the shrine had 19 names written on it of local people killed since 2015 in the region's ruthless scramble for land. "It's not just her," said Sister Jane Dwyer, Stang's octogenarian colleague who was still working here with the poor and landless. "It's everyone in this municipality, starting with us. Life here is threatened." The two gunmen who killed Stang one morning in the forest with 6 shots, the middleman who arranged it, the 2 ranchers who paid 50,000 reais to have her killed, have all served prison time, if sporadically and never for very long, considering the gravity of the crime. One of the landowners, Vitalmiro de Moura, aka Bida, has been arrested, tried, and released 4 times. Some of the chaotic legal processes were captured in a documentary, They Killed Sister Dorothy, voiced by Martin Sheen. But at least something was done. For the other 19 victims, no one has been tried, and in many cases, locals feel police barely bothered to investigate. Stories like this just keep coming, like shots from an automatic rifle. They are as repetitive as the plots of old Western movies. The murders of peasants and smallholders and indigenous leaders working or protecting a piece of forest cut down by gunmen paid by ranchers and farmers to do their dirty work. They are the crimes that fizzle out in the quagmire of the Brazilian justice system and the damp indifference of local cops. So that's just that's an extract that really describes a little bit of what Dom knew was going on, what he went and investigated, and bravely continued, even though he knew how dangerous it was, he continued to go out there, didn't he, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember, well, I was scrolling through the WhatsApp messages I received from Dom, and I know that after Bolsonaro took power, he was saying that, you know, everything that the president says is incendiary. He's talking endlessly about fake news. He's calling journalists liars, and he said he's making life more dangerous for journalists. You know, horribly prescient words, and also incredibly relevant right now when we have national leaders saying similar things and kind of putting more pressure on journalists and putting them in more danger. And Dom kept at it despite those dangers. And to some degree, he died because he really wanted to hear both sides of the story. He went to the Javari Valley. First of all, he listened to the people, the indigenous people mostly, defending the Javari Valley, which is their territory. But then he wanted to talk to the fishers, the fishing communities who were doing the invading, about why they're doing it. And it was because he did that he kind of alerted somebody who wanted to kill Bruno Pereira, the guy he was with. So you know, he was a really hard, you know, doing journalism the way journalism should be done. But in the Amazon, that's a really dangerous thing to do. So, yes, he was very courageous.
The times we are living in, there really is, you know, it's thrown about, this phrase war on nature, but there really is a war on nature, and there really is a war on environmental journalists. I mean, the figures are absolutely horrific. I just looked them up actually. More than 45 murders in the last 15 years, and they're the ones that we know about. There are so many journalists who aren't official journalists for Western outlets who we just, you know, just getting murdered in so many ways, and that doesn't even count the intimidation.
And of course,
yeah, the RSF was saying that in the last 2 years, 85 press freedom violations. It is really horrific, and it takes huge bravery to work in these circumstances. Maybe you can describe exactly what happened to Dom and Bruno, and explain what they were. You were explaining they were investigating the fishers who were invading indigenous territory and damaging it, and they were betrayed, right?
Yeah, I think you can say that, and I suppose that just the one point I would add, one statistic I would add to the one you provided, was that in addition, of course, to journalists and how dangerous life is for journalists, it's even more dangerous for people on the front line of the war against nature, for people who are defenders of the land or the environment. And journalists are dying at the rate of, it's horrendous. It's like the past 2 years been one journalist dying every 3 days. And for environmental defenders, it's closer to like one every two. It's more than one every 2 days. So, and most of those cases go unreported because they happen in really remote areas. And one of the things Don was trying to do was report on a group of indigenous and not just indigenous, but mainly indigenous guardians in the Javadi Valley, who are protecting their territory against, all sorts of invaders, primarily, most obviously, illegal fishers, but illegal hunters, some illegal miners at other areas, narco trafficking through their territory. And he was really inspired by the person he was with, Bruno Pereira, a Brazilian indigenous expert, one of the leading indigenous experts in Brazil, who knew the territory, who spoke the languages, who lived with the indigenous people, and who spoke to absolutely everyone. And he'd traveled with Bruno to the same area 4 years earlier and had an experience deep in the forest that his sister and wife said, transformed him. It was a transformative experience. And so he was coming to the end of his book. He'd actually done almost all the reporting that he planned to do. And this was to be his last or penultimate trip. And he wanted to see how this uptick of threats was being dealt with by the local people, because the government at that time under President Bolsonaro, who was very much on the far right and as we've discussed, was all in favor of kind of opening up the forest to exploitation. And under Bolsonaro, the government took a step back and stopped protecting territory, weakened regulations, invested less, had less recruitment into those areas. So the indigenous people with Bruno Pereira set up their own monitoring teams using GPS, using drones. It's brilliant, really, and effective. But yes, it upset the people who'd got used to going into that indigenous territory and taking what they wanted. So Don wanted to get into the heart of this because it covered so many of the key issues facing the Amazon. But when he went, as I said, he went to talk to to one of the fishers' villages. The first person he interviewed then told somebody in the next village. This is what the police told me. And that person, a guy who was called Amarildo, a nickname Pelado, he got in his motorboat and he chased them down and shot them. And he didn't. I think his target was Bruno Pereira, but he killed Dom to silence him. You know, and it's a very horribly typical way for journalists to die, by bearing witness to crimes, and that's what happened. Yeah.
I mean, it's a really extraordinary tragedy, and obviously it's a personal tragedy for you, because you were friends with him, as well as, of course, his the two men's wives and families. But it's also, you know, I was talking earlier about the Amazon being of planetary importance. So journalists telling these stories, and the great many people who are doing their best to protect and conserve the forest are doing a job for all of us. They really are serving on this war against nature on all of our behalf. We owe them this huge debt, and they are dying at an enormous rate. Now, what struck me about this book and made it so special was that in order to save the Amazon, as the title says, in order to protect it from the fact that it is extraordinarily rich in natural biodiversity wealth, and in all the systems it helps us with, you know, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, etc. But also, of course, in gold, in energy, in all sorts of other resources, not to mention the land that is required for ranching and so on. In order to protect it, it's not the job of these individual people. It has to be a collaborative community effort. And that's the story he was trying to say, in a way. It was the story that, you know, the indigenous people, the people that actually live there, can find new ways to protect it. And so what struck me about this book is that after Dom's murder, his friends and colleagues got together and said, we will collaboratively bring this book to fruition. And that's such a beautiful triumph, I think, against in this horrific war. I'd really like to hear a little bit about how you took this on, why you took this on, because you kind of spearheaded this, didn't you? And I think, really, before we talk about that, I think there is another extract written by Eliana Brum, which really kind of explains this really difficult problem that you had, in that you had all these notes, you had a half-finished book, and you somehow had to create it, which was, you know, with the help of you know, John's agent and the other people that he talked to, and all the researchers and so on. It must have been phenomenal. And I know she wrote so beautifully about that kind of personal difficulty in being an author on someone else's thing. If you could read that, that would be amazing.
Thank you. I will. I just want to underscore that for me, at least, this book, the key message is solidarity. And there was a small group chosen by Dom's widow, Alessandra Sampaio, and she honored us by choosing us. And there was our book group, we just called it that, the Dom book group. There was 5 of us. Then we chose the chapter writers, and there was 8 of those. And then Dom had so many talented friends who all wanted to be involved. Many have written books themselves. And so we asked them to help with editing. So there were 20 people involved in editing. Then photographers he'd worked with, 5 of them, all volunteered. Others volunteered to organize events. 500 people got involved by donating money for this event. So it's just a huge, you know, gesture of love for Dom, but and also, I think, an expression of how important these stories are about the Amazon, about environmental defenders, about looking for solutions, all of these big things. But yes, the challenge was that when Dom died, he'd written an introduction and 3.5 chapters, and left 6 and a bit to be finished. And he'd left notes and he'd left an outline, and some of the chapters were quite well formed. Others, it was really like a riddle, trying to piece together his scrawling handwriting, and his family helped us to try to decipher that. And then we tried to we sent people out around the Amazon to try to retrace his footsteps and engage in a dialogue with what they knew of Dom, to try to reconstruct what they thought he was looking for. So it's a kind of a mystery too. And Dom appears in every chapter, and every chapter is the contributor plus Dom Phillips. He belonged, he has ownership over every chapter, and it is his book, on the cover.
It's so
Dom
beautiful
Phillips
that you've really achieved that. I think you've really achieved that, because you start off with Dom, but also you get that sense of direction from the other writer as well. I think it's a really rich book.
That's really good to hear. And I'll read the chapter just to put it in context. So one of the many challenges we faced in trying to finish the book was, how do you make that transition between the 3.5 chapters that Dom had done and then the chapters that the rest of us would be doing, which would obviously have different voices and different feelings. And we tried to make a virtue out of it, if that's the right word, but we tried to make it, to make a memorial in the middle of the book, essentially. But the challenge of moving on to that second section and making that transition went to Eliane Brum, who is my beloved wife as well, as being
and a fantastic author in her own right.
In her own right, really.
Of a book on the Amazon as well, which I urge everyone to read, because it is also a brilliant book.
But to read, so her transition chapter. So this is after the memorial in the middle of the book, and the transition as we kind of go from Dom's interrupted prose to a new chapter called A Cemetery of Trees. And Eliane begins. I remember pale blue eyes set in a face stitched by the sun. It was August 2021, summer in the Amazon, meaning 40 degrees Celsius and slim chances of clouds dotting the sky. I was at a protest led by land rights campaigner Erasmo Teofilio outside the courthouse in the city of Altamira in the state of Pará. The protest was another chapter in the battle to establish a settlement in Anapu, the municipality that had swallowed up the body of Dorothy Stang. Dom and I shared a sliver of shade by a wall across the street. There we were in one of Brazil's most violent cities, both staring out at the same scene. Dom asked if he could talk to me for his new book, and I said I could meet him the next day, but he would be gone by then. That is how we came to never see each other again. I remember thinking his eyes were the same color as the punishing sky in the Amazonian summer. Possibly the only thing connecting that well-intentioned man from the northwest of England to the brutality unfolding beneath the vast blue. How could I have known that those same eyes would be gunned down in a different Amazon, closing their blue for all time? I can't step into Dom's body to take up this writing project, born from a vision that was his alone. So I'll have to do it with my own eyes, which are the color of tree bark or nut skins, or of the earth where I've seen so many bullet-ridden bodies buried. I know what he saw. I've conducted countless interviews with the same people he spoke to and written dozens of articles, including a book of my own about the Amazon. But what I see and hear may be different, and it's important for readers to know this. If Dom and I had met up to discuss his book, I might have told him that the Amazon isn't so much saved as defended every day by people like Erasmo Teofilio, Raimundo Gomes de Silva, Antonio Melo, Juma Shipaya. I would have said that it's not us who save the forest, but the forest who saves us every day. And I don't mean that imaginary entity packaged as a large green mass. I mean the loud chatter of interlinked and interdependent beings of all shapes and sizes, both below and above ground. I may have told Dom that the forest is not about individuals or groups, but about relationships. I might have suggested he use a different title for the book, but we didn't meet up. And so it's fallen to me to take up the pen and write this chapter, not long after that brutal interruption of bullets, which we did not so much hear as feel.
Yeah, it's very powerful. And she makes a good point about the idea of saving the Amazon, how to save the Amazon. And there is a difficulty, isn't there, of a man from the Wirral or from anyone else going into territory which is very much lived in by Indigenous people and saying this is how we save it. But that's not really what he meant, was it?
No, and I mean, well, first of all, I think we face up to that. The chapters face up to that, and the book ends. The afterword of the book is written by an Indigenous man, a very influential Indigenous man called Beto Marubu, who will visit the UK for the launch, I'm delighted to say, in conjunction with another brilliant writer, and these you know, and Beto writes, we've kind of had enough of white saviors, and that the Amazon should not be seen as the problem. The Amazon needs to be seen as the solution. But he made it clear that he didn't see Dom as someone who said, I'm offering the solution. Dom was different. Dom's original subheadline was how to save the Amazon, ask the people who know. So it was quite humble to go out and look and talk to people who might have answers. And I think that's really what he set out to do. And Beto was very convinced by him. And in the, towards the end of Beto's afterword, he writes, we need more Dom Phillips, we need more Bruno Pereiras. So yeah, Dom's intention wasn't to say, I know what's right, I'm a wise person. It was, I am going to look for solutions. And
the solutions that he found were very much not along the sort of old school of conservation, which is basically get rid of all the people, they're the problem, and then just kind of keep it as a sort of mausoleum of nature, and then everything will be fine. What was the solution that he drew and that you all drew essentially as you wrote this book?
Well, there are a whole bunch of solutions, and as Dom wrote, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing. It has to be a panoply of different different things happening at the same time, from government action to rethinking the economy to more corporate responsibility and accountability and traceability, to pharmaceutical companies sharing the benefits of what they discover in the Amazon, which is, the world's biggest laboratory and of mix and match species. It has to be about Indigenous people defending themselves. But the thing that struck me, and we didn't know how Dom would conclude his book. We didn't. I talked to Rebecca Carter, who's been part of our group, a really brilliant and inspiring member of our Dom book group from the start. And she and the notes suggest that Dom was kind of working organically towards his conclusion. He hadn't made any, he didn't have a preconceived, I will say this at the end. He wanted to see where all the different voices took him. But the one headline in his notes that struck me was listen to Indigenous people, that Indigenous people have lived with the forest for a long time. And, some of the people that he was planning to talk to are Indigenous philosophers. And there's also a lot of new archaeology that's showing that Indigenous communities in the past had a really advanced relationship with the forest, and that the forest wasn't just a wilderness. It was actually, a lot of the forest was planted by indigenous people. And there's, a huge number of super abundant plants that statistically wouldn't be there in such large numbers were it not for some kind of intervention. So they tend to be fruit trees like acai, or medicinal trees like babasu, and so on.
Cacao. And these, of course, the sort of evolved practices and cultures of the indigenous people who were living more sustainably. They actually attract their own kinds of biodiversity to eat the fruit and to eat that. So it sort of enriches it. And so it was kind of this sustainable coexistence. But of course, against this, there is this huge political dilemma. I mean, so we have Bolsonaro, who undid a lot of the gains in deforestation reductions that Lula managed to achieve, and then he basically well, I mean, you can talk about some of the things he did in terms of making it more attractive for ranchers and mining companies and dam companies and so on, and that was very damaging. But now, where are we? So Lula is back in, Bolsonaro is out. Has there been a huge turnaround?
There has been a partial turnaround. There's been many encouraging developments in the first year and a bit of well, we're now more than 2 years, I suppose, into Lula's administration. There is something like a 50% fall in deforestation, which is wonderful, a huge improvement from what happened before. That said, there's still deforestation happening all the time. And so climate scientists and Amazon experts like Carlos Nobre, who's maybe the most famous of them all, is saying that the forest is still moving towards a tipping point, after which it's very close now. And it's not enough now even just to stop deforestation. It's necessary to start reforestation. And there are some really big and interesting projects that in that regard, which are incredibly encouraging. But the problem is the government can do a lot through command and control measures, rules and enforcement and police and so on. But you really need the market to essentially finally value a forest more alive than dead. That's the essence of it. And so building a bioeconomy, if you want to call it that, or valuing a forest, not just economically, but in other ways, is essential. And having a new relationship with the forest, which sounds very abstract, but I think it does have to be on a different level, that you can't just think of the forest as, a resource for everyone else. You have to build a different relationship. And that's another way where it's worthwhile. Dom was moving definitely in that direction towards listening more to indigenous people, which does not mean go back in time, because these days, every indigenous community has a Starlink, and there's a mix of new technology, old way or traditional ways of thinking about the forest, and there's some exciting things going on, but there's also a lot of really scary stuff going on. And Lula is doing something, quite a lot. Marina really wants to do a lot more, his environment minister, but politically, the dominant force in Brazil at the moment is Congress, and Congress is controlled by the extractive industry.
Yeah, the other issue is, of course, this is not just a problem for Brazil, right? This is something that globally we need to support and we need to change. And that is something that is, if we look at the COP on biodiversity, for example, do you think it went far enough? Do you think that the safeguards are fully in place?
No, not even close. I mean, there's a million things wrong with the global environmental governance infrastructure. I mean, I think biodiversity and climate should be together rather than separated for a start. I mean, I'm now talking my ideas rather than Dom's ideas for sure. But, you know, one of Dom's chapters in looks at other countries. You know, one looks at Costa Rica as a possible model of solutions, and another of the ones
so the reason you're looking at Costa Rica is because they have done so much to restore their deforested land, and also put a really important value on nature and biodiversity.
Yeah, I think that's why Dom went there. I don't think it's a perfect model. I know there's lots of flaws, but they've probably gone further than almost any other country in thinking in terms of ecosystem service payments and trying to value what the forest gives back and trying to encourage ecotourism. And as I said, no one solution is enough, but at least, you know, making large-scale experiments and increasing canopy cover. It's not always ideal canopy, but yeah, you've got to keep experimenting, you've got to keep trying. Got to keep.
Yeah, I mean, there's another, well, sticking to the Americas, there's another movement really towards recognizing the rights of natural systems, so the right of a river and the rights of a forest and so on. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm really interested in this movement. I've followed it a lot. It's not something that came across Dom's radar. For me at least, I really, it has been around since the 70s, the idea of rights of nature, but it's been given new life, I think, in the last 2 or 3 years. So it would kind of, unfortunately, after Dom was killed, so he didn't have a chance to look into that. But I find that is, yeah, another way of trying to set a new relationship with nature with a focus on the law. But the rights of nature movement is much bigger than just lawyers. It's kind of lawyers and constitutional scholars and artists, poets, novelists, dancers. It's incredibly broad. So trying to look at the problem from all perspectives, which is encouraging, but it's still at an early, if very inspiring stage.
And so if you can, I'll just ask you like the last question, I suppose, before we open it up to audience questions. I'm just wondering, this process of taking on another person's passion project, essentially, and making it your passion project collectively, this idea that there is a way of saving the Amazon, that hope isn't all lost, that we aren't you know, automatically going to pass these horrendous Earth system tipping points where the forest is no longer self-sustaining. Do you believe that? Do you feel that the world is engaged enough to push forward and actually protect this ecosystem, this precious ecosystem?
I think it hasn't done enough, clearly, because the trend is still in the wrong direction. I think Dom and Bruno were two people who ultimately gave their lives for this, who devoted themselves fully into this, and that we need more people like them who go into the forest, learn the reality as journalists should do, or whatever they cover, and report back on what's working and what's not working. And so that then politics and economics at least know what they need to do. Whether you can get the political will to make the changes needed, as we all know, right now, doesn't look too brilliant with all the trends we see. But as long as you put those options on the table, then you have to hope that when people come to realize that the direction we're going in now is only going to make everybody's lives worse, humans and non-humans, and the economy, if that's their most important thing to them, worse, then I think people will start looking at more radical solutions in places where they didn't look before, in places like the Amazon. And if we center our debates and our thinking on life and diversity, then we'll look more at the Amazon, because that's where life and diversity is. It's not just about money and power. So I think Dom was looking at the right things and listening to the right people. And I hope that his book can encourage other people to do the same.
Thank you so much, John. And it is an incredible book. I'm just having a look. This isn't a question as such, but it's interesting, from Fiona Frank from Lancaster, who says that in 2022, after hearing about Dom and Bruno's deaths, she worked with Sian, who is Dom's sister, and his nieces, to produce an exhibition to honour those who have lost their lives in defence of the rainforest. And this year they've been working with Dom's widow Alessandra to update the exhibition to reflect the political changes in Brazil. And it's going to be on show at the Hay Book Festival this year. So do go along. And have a look at that if you're at Hay this year. And you're talking at Hay, right? Are you?
Yeah, and I mean, Fiona's done some amazing work. The exhibition's really great. I hope a lot of people can see it. It will also be shown in Lancaster, because so Alessandra will visit from Japan, Beto Marubu will visit from Japan, and I will be with them, and we'll talk first at the Hay Festival on the 31st of May, and then we'll go to Lancaster, which is closer to Dom's home region, and do a talk there, and the exhibition will be there. And then we'll go to Foyle's bookshop for the London launch on the 5th of June. But yes, great thanks to Fiona. I'm glad she's here. Hello, Fiona.
Yeah, that would be worth looking at. There's another question here, which is, I guess, it's from Tony Edwards, who talks about how the UK and most of Europe chopped down their forests over the last hundreds of years, and now we're wailing about Brazil must keep its forest. I mean, there is a bit of hypocrisy there, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I think that we have to face up to that, those of us who come from those countries. I hear this argument a lot in the Amazon, where I live, and when I go to visit and interview farmers in particular, and you talk to them, and they always say this. And what I say to them, apart from recognizing that they are correct, is that, well, two things. First, that most European countries, and indeed China for that matter, cut down most of their forests hundreds of years ago, before there was any talk of climate change or any awareness that there would be global knock-on effects. I think they probably did know about what it would do to water systems and mudslides and things like that. There was probably an awareness of that, but there was no knowledge of climate disasters and how that might be affected. So I think we're much more aware of the dangers now, as with CO2. So I think that makes a very big difference. And the second thing would be that a lot of those countries that did deforest very significantly are now reforesting quite significantly. Like Germany, for example, has planted a really huge number of trees. And China has an enormous tree planting operation underway. So I think if you add that to the fact that tropical forests are also much, much more efficient at storing carbon than non-tropical forests, and plus they're home to that much more biodiversity, I think there are many reasons why the Amazon today is a very special case, and we don't have to follow the worst examples of history.
Absolutely, we really don't.
And it doesn't mean we don't pay either. Yeah. There is a payment that needs to be made from the outside world, from the global north to Brazil and countries like Brazil. Yes, there is a reckoning to be made, and part of that has to be financial. But yeah, don't follow the worst example.
Absolutely. This is a planetary wealth that we must all pay to preserve. Another question: what effect is COP30 going to have on the rainforest? I mean, this is the big climate conference talking about all of these issues, and of course, roads are going to have to be made. There's been a lot of forest clearing, I've read, in order to host it. I mean,
Yeah,
tell me about that. What's going on, John?
I was in Belém last month to look at this, and I think there's two stories. One that gets told a lot, and I think it's the obvious story for foreign correspondents, like me, to write about, which is, yes, when you're building the facilities and upgrading roads, there is a certain amount of tree clearance that's regrettable. Some of it is not necessary. And that does need to be reported on. And there isn't much of an environmental governance system in place at all in Belém. But the other side
I've been
of it,
there. It's quite,
yeah.
The amazing thing is about a lot of these places is they still, to me, when I visited them, they feel very much like frontier towns, right?
They
Still,
are.
they feel they've got that kind of edge, and that's there's that uncomfortable feeling that anything could happen, and they feel quite lawless, and they don't feel like a nice, well-protected, Danish resort.
Well, they're definitely not. And that gets to the second story that doesn't get very well reported. And many of my sort of Brazilian climate, environment friends, civil society friends were complaining that the story doesn't get reported, which was they're saying, yes, Belém has loads of problems. It's one of the poorest cities in one of the poorest countries, not one of the poorest, but a developing country, Brazil. It has loads of problems. It's not going to be Copenhagen or Bonn. But they were saying, look, if you look at the world's problems right now, it isn't us because we're building roads or we haven't done the hotels in time. It's because the global north hasn't contributed it's anywhere near enough to help countries like ours make the transition in terms of energy and to protect the forest. And it's because so many other countries are spending a fortune on wars at the moment. And just a fraction of the money being spent on wars could go and could solve most of the energy transition problems. So there is this sense that everyone's focusing on Belém being, poor and disorganized, but in fact the real problem isn't Belém. It's the global north, and I think I have some sympathy for that argument.
There is something, and there is also though the charge that does the COP need to be that big? Does it need to have this many people flown from around the world to, I mean, essentially some sort of, it's like a big fair, and the delegates are just a tiny part of this. Does it need to be so big?
It will be much smaller. This will be much smaller just because Belém can't get close to the last three COPs, and there will be many more participants from civil society because the last three there wasn't any opportunity for that, and most of those participants will be sleeping in hammocks, I think. But in terms of nice hotels for corporate lobbyists, there just won't be space for them. So it will be a slimmed down COP by necessity, if nothing else. But I think there does need to be the meeting. But yes, a global governance meeting like this. But yes, should it be packed full of lobbyists? No, I don't think so.
Yeah. You've been writing this book for 3, I think, was it 3 years, 4 years?
Yes, 3. Yeah.
I mean, it came out of this really horrific murder, which was because of Dom's position, was broadcast around the world. It was kept very prominent in news cycles for some time. I'm just wondering what sort of reception it's received. Are people open? Are people open to the idea? Are people engaged in the idea that the Amazon is in the midst of a war, and that there is something important going on there?
Yes, for sure. I mean, there's been a huge response to the book. Loads of people have got involved. Loads of people have donated. Loads of people who couldn't donate have posted supportive messages on social media. So I think there's a huge number of people who are very engaged in this issue. And I've been surprised that some of the media who's really wanted to engage with this book. It's not just the Guardian. You know, obviously I'm a Guardian for 30 years, but it goes much wider than that. And we have a very excellent publisher in North America, Chelsea Green. We have an excellent publisher in Brazil, Companhia das Letras.
And how is it being received? How is it being received in Brazil? What's the reaction been? What was the reaction to Dom's murder in Brazil, actually?
That was a huge story. Yeah, it was enormous, and the repercussions are still felt today. Dom and Bruno images appear on carnival floats in Rio. They're in wall murals around Brazil, posters. There's been exhibitions in the Biennale. There are films being made. So yeah, there's a huge interest. And you know, Bruno was a really impressive figure in his own right. And the combination of the two of them, the journalist and the indigenous expert together, it's as if they're locked in eternal brotherhood in terms of the images that you get of them on posters and lapel badges and the like. So I think they're still kind of working, both of them, in a different way now. And yeah, not the way any of us would have wanted them to be working, but they're still doing really good work. And this is absolutely their book. Yeah. We just filled in the gaps.
Well, that is a beautiful story, and it is their book, but it is also the work of solidarity, the work of you know, a collective effort. And I'm just show you the cover again. I don't know if it's appearing back to front, probably. How to Save the Amazon, and I really recommend that you buy this because this is such an important cause, and it's a beautiful book. And thank you so much for talking to me, John. It's been such a pleasure. I wish that we were in the same room, but it's lovely to talk to you virtually.
Well, likewise, Gaia. Really, really thank you very much for your questions and your interest and your kind words. And thank you to everybody who's out there listening. Can't see any of your faces, but I'm really feeling the love. And yeah, I'm sure, yeah, I don't know. I hope Dom, wherever he is also feeling it, because there's a lot of it out there.
John, Gaia, thank you so much for such a fascinating discussion. It was informative and poignant, and a real tribute to Dom's incredible work and to the ongoing battle for the Amazon. So thank you both so much, and to everyone in the audience for all of your questions. It was a real honour for us to host this first public conversation about this very special book, and you can order your copies of that from Newham Bookshop. Details are there in the chat, so do check that out. And thank you, John and Gaia, again for such a brilliant conversation. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.